From Simply Timeless, this is In Studio. I'm your host, Jay Daniels. Time and time again, we hear the stories of careers shaped by seemingly coincidental events. We think that the stories shared by percussionist and producer Gregg Field are more than just coincidence. You're going to hear how a backstage meeting led to his performance with the Count Basie Orchestra, and later with Ella Fitzgerald and Frank Sinatra. Gregg also shares a little insight on the recent Concord release, Ella at 100, live at the Apollo. Let's start from the beginning with Gregg's early days on the West Coast. Here's Gregg Field.
I'm from the East Bay outside of San Francisco, and my father was actually a surgeon and my mother was a nurse. And they got up in the morning, went to work together, had lunch together, went back to work. They were always together, but were very supportive of my musical interests early on, not anticipating I would do this for a living. But yeah, I started playing trumpet when I was in the first grade. And then a few years later, when I was in the fourth grade, we were going to put a little band together and they didn't need a trumpet player. They needed a drummer. So I said, well, sure, I can play drums. And I got a little kit for my birthday and haven't stopped.
Your parents
since.
didn't mind you making all that noise at home then?
They were cool with it. I had one neighbor on one side that was also cool and one that just hated it. So it's like, you just do what you have to.
This music that you were playing in school, was this, like your typical band music, or was this jazz focused?
No. I hadn't heard really any jazz at all that I was aware of. And I was playing, like cover songs from the 60s, pop songs. So I was in the fourth grade, and my parents took my brother and I to Disneyland, as they would every year in the summertime, and we would just run around. And I noticed there was a large stage with curtain was closed, and I was standing there waiting to see what was going to happen, and the curtains opened up, and it was Count Basie and his band, and I had never heard jazz. And I was stunned as a 10-year-old. I mean, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I had never had a reaction like that to any music that I'd heard. And I'm looking around, and I don't see any other 10-year-olds reacting like I did, but I was really pumped up from this. And I asked my dad to buy every Count Basie record he could find. I'd been playing drums for, I don't know, maybe just short of a year. And I would come home, Jay, every day, and I would practice and practice and practice to these Count Basie records. And I got so obsessed that I could sing every trumpet part. I could sing the saxophone part. I could tell you when they opened up their vibrato. I could try to play the drum part as best I could. And this obsession went on for 7 years. And we had a great music program in my school system. So I'm a senior in high school, and I read in the newspaper that Basie and Ella are going to perform in San Francisco at a theater for a week. So I bought a ticket to every concert, and I would stand outside the stage door, and Basie's band bus would pull up, and the guys would get out, and I recognized every one of them, and they would go in, and after they went in, I would walk around the front of the theater, sit down and watch the concert, drive home. So I did this on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Saturday night, they were going to do 2 shows, and my girlfriend and I were going to go to the second show. And she called me that afternoon and said, I'm not feeling good. And I thought, well, I got nothing to do. I'll go to the first show. So, Jay, like I had done every other night, I'm standing at the stage door, and the band bus pulls up, and out come the guys. And that night, one of the guys stopped, the baritone saxophone player, John Williams, and said, you work here? And I said, no. And he said, well, why are you out here every night? Because I'd be smiling at him, just kind of Google-eyed, right? And I said, well, I'm a drummer, and I'm just a big fan of the band. And he said, well, I'm John Williams. I said, I know. You're John Calvin Williams, and you joined the band in 1968, and you're from South Carolina. And he was, I guess, amused at that. He invited me backstage. So suddenly, I found myself in this green room, and there's Freddie Green, the iconic guitarist, and there's all these guys, that Eddie Lockjaw Davis and Al Gray, and heroes of mine. Well, Basie hadn't shown up yet. He was coming by private car. And it was time for the band to get on stage. So the whole band is assembled in the wings of this theater. And I'm standing there, and up comes Basie. And John said, what's your name? And I said, Gregg Field. He said, Basie, this is Gregg, and he's a drummer, and he's a big fan. And Basie was a really nice guy. And I talked to him for a minute, maybe, right? And it's time for the band to get on stage. So the whole band walks out on stage, and they're about to introduce Basie. And the manager comes up and says, "Hey, Basie, Sonny Payne's not here." Now, Sonny Payne was the drummer. And Basie said, "Didn't you say you were a drummer?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You want to play?" I said, "Yeah." And I walked out and I sat down on Payne's drums. And I looked to my left where the music would normally be. And I said to Al Gray, the trombone player, I said, "Where's the music?" And he said, "Well, we don't pull the music out for Sonny. He knows it." And at that moment, I hear, "Ladies and gentlemen, Count Basie." And he comes walking out and he sits down and he starts to play Splanky, which was a song that I'd played in my bedroom at my parents' house hundreds of times. And I ended up playing the whole concert for him. And I knew every one of the songs. And when the concert was over and they were going to take intermission before they went to Ella, Basie had me stand up. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I don't remember this young man's name. I just met him. And he covered us tonight. Would you please give him a hand?" And I thought I was on acid. It's like I'm a senior in high school, and suddenly my ultimate dream has unfolded before me. And Ella heard that some kid out of the audience was playing, and she walked out and stood in the wings and watched the concert. And that's when I met Ella that night as well. And so Basie remembered me. And about 7 years later, after I'd been on the road, I'd worked with Ray Charles on the road, and I worked with Harry James, and I worked with Mel Torme. And my phone rang one afternoon, and it was Count Basie asking me to join his band. And that was in 1980, almost 40 years ago. And I spent 3 years working with the band and touring. So that's my young musical
Did your girlfriend believe that story when you told her that later that night?
Man, nobody believed it. I didn't tell her that night. I got home probably around 11 o'clock, and my parents had just gone to bed. I woke them up, and I said, "You're not going to believe this. I played with Count Basie tonight." And it was a little stunning for them because they knew of my obsession. The guys that wouldn't believe me is I went back to my high school band on Monday, and I said, "I played with Basie on Saturday night at the Circle Star Theater." And they thought I was full of, bullshit, actually. But it happened. And, the reason that I don't believe in coincidence, and the reason that Payne wasn't there is that every night those concerts were at 8 o'clock. Well, because they were doing two, there was a 7 o'clock concert, and Sonny simply forgot that it was an earlier concert. So if you look at it in the macro, the fact that my girlfriend canceled that day, and the fact that of all those nights that John Williams stopped me that night, I mean, it's beyond coincidence. And I find that those kind of crazy great things have happened many times over my career.
I think everything happens for a reason, Greg. I talked to Ramsey Lewis yesterday, someone whose music I have admired for many, many years. Never thought I would have the opportunity to talk with him. And I emailed a lot of the artists on our roster. And I said, "Are they available for interview?" And his manager wrote back, said, "Sure. He'd love to talk to you." And he told me, he said, and it was funny. It was a lot of similarity to what you were just talking about. He said, when I was a kid, when I was in my teens and early 20s, he said, even when I was playing gigs, he's like, we never anticipated playing in New York, playing in Washington, going around the world. He said, we were just playing music. He said, but the opportunities continued to come our way. He said, we never forgot those either. And you got to play with Basie in the early 80s, which, it was toward the end of his career. What great music he put out. There is an album that was recorded just before you joined the orchestra, 1979. It was released on the Pablo label with Ella and the Basie Orchestra, A Perfect Match. And Ella had worked extensively with Basie over the years. In fact, there were recordings of theirs from, the late 50s, early 60s. But there was a point to where you would also work for Ella not too many years later after your association with the Basie Orchestra.
Yeah, I left Basie at the end of '82. I got offered a position, a teaching position at University of Southern California. And it was a good transition for me because I really, my dreams, I suppose, had moved on to wanting to work in the studios in LA. I was always fascinated with the recording process. And I'd been back in LA about a year and a half, and the phone rang one afternoon, and it was Ella's road manager saying, could I come out and cover one gig for her drummer, Bobby Durham, who'd been with Ella for years. And I came out and I covered it. And then it wasn't 2 or 3 months later that Bobby decided to leave, and they called, and I joined Ella permanently.
How would you describe your collaboration with her? This was in a quartet setting, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, it was Paul Smith, the piano player, who'd been there forever. I mean, he'd gone in and out of her gig. He was famously on the Ella in Berlin in 1960 album. Southern California resident. Keter Betts, the bass player, who'd been there, I think, since the early 70s. And then, of course, Joe Pass, who she had the incredible career with. Yeah, so we were the quartet. And it was really her family. She wasn't married. She didn't really have a life outside of a romantic life. She was home and here in LA, and loved getting out on the road and us traveling and making music.
Even in that short period of time, just a few years working with Ella, surely it had some sort of impact upon your career as far as what she was able to teach you, as far as her timing, her phrasing, and really what she wanted of you being the drummer.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jay. I learned a lot from all these artists that I work with. I worked with most of these artists when I was in my 20s. And in a lot of ways, like with Basie, with Ella, I had to draw on all the ability that I could to try to just have enough knowledge to play the gig. I wasn't going to be Sonny Payne on Count Basie's band, but I absorbed so much. And one of the things I learned from Ella is, first of all, she was incapable of anything than giving an absolutely 100% of her in any time she was on stage. And I haven't worked with that many people that were like that. Frank Sinatra was like that. But a lot of what I learned was, as a drummer, was where to place the beat that I'm playing in relation to the vocalist. And that's probably the best, probably the most used piece of knowledge that I have, even now, is learning the relationship between the drummer and the singer. I love working with singers. And when I first joined Ella, she said something that I didn't understand. She said, when you play drums for me, I have more air. And I never really understood it at that point. And what she was talking about is that if she were to sing a phrase, where I would play the snare drum, the backbeat, would be in a direct relationship, the timing of it, to where she sang. And that knowledge paid off for me. Ella, the reason that I stopped working with Ella is that she had a heart attack on the road. We were in Art Park, is a venue outside of Niagara Falls, and unfortunately she had congestive heart failure while we were on the road. And then not long after that, I joined Frank Sinatra. And Frank had the same drummer for 25 years, Irv Kotler. And they were also great friends. And Irv died. And they started going through drummers like you can't imagine. Frank fired 4 drummers and 2 bass players in 6 months. And I got the call. And the only reason Frank knew about me is that I did a TV special with him back with Basie in the early 80s called A Man and His Music. And it was Basie and Frank. We did a couple songs. And so I got the call. I thought, wow, he fired 4 really good drummers. And it was a month tour of Europe. And I thought, well, I'm going to get fired like everybody else, but I'll have the fun and I can put him on my resume. So I got to the first gig. And Frank never showed up to any of the rehearsals. We were rehearsing in London for 3 days with this big orchestra. And I knew the music. I mean, we all know it. We've heard it a million times. So the first concert is in Antwerp, Belgium, in an arena that seated about 18,000 people. And we're on the floor, and Frank is up on a stage, a square stage. And I don't see Frank until the audience does. He doesn't show up at the sound check, nothing. And, I'm pretty nervous, actually. And my heart's beating pretty hard in my chest. And And, I hear, ladies and gentlemen, Frank Sinatra, and he comes up on stage. And the first tune I played with him was Come Fly With Me. So, if you're a drummer, you really need to take charge. That's your job. So I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go for it. I think I know what I need to do here. And I started to play, and about a minute after I started to play, Frank walked over to the side of the stage and looked down, and he smiled and he shook his head like, yes. I thought, well, okay, this isn't as hard as I thought. And I'll tell you what it came down to. It came down to your question, which was I simply played where Frank sang. He gave you such a huge rhythmic target, as did Ella. And I think the knowledge I got from Basie and Ray Charles, but mostly Basie, was finally paying off in a big way why I worked with Frank. And I stayed with Frank 5 years until he retired and did the duets records. And, it really came down to, I listened to what the other drummers did, and they weren't doing that. Frank would sing a line and you'd hear the reaction of the drummer just not quite centered like it should be. And Frank was really used to a very specific thing. So, yeah, I think and to this day, I'll give you one more piece of that. The great singer Joe Williams, right? I'd been with Basie about 6 months, and we were playing at Carnegie Hall. And I'm at Carnegie Hall, and I'm freaking out. Are you kidding? I'm at Carnegie Hall. This is amazing. And Joe comes up to me, and he said, Greg, listen. He said, you got to learn to spank the beat from the bottom. And I said, what do you mean? And he sang this rhythm. And he showed me how, by the way he sang it and the way he kind of popped his hand, where the beats 2 and 4 should be, what we call the backbeat. I tell you, Jay, that was probably the best drum lesson I ever got. And when you say you got your best drum lesson from a singer, most drummers would start laughing at that, but it was absolutely true. And to this day, whether I'm playing pop music, because I hardly play any more big band music or jazz, whether it's Latin pop, whatever the genre is, it's understanding that rhythmic relationship between the singer and where you're playing is really fundamentally what makes things work.
You're well known for your work as a percussionist, but you're also well known for your work as a record and television producer. Give us some of the history about how you were also able to dabble in that part of your career.
It really comes out of a curiosity, Jay. I love the recording process. I'm as intrigued by how to make a reverb work on a record as I am about playing drums. Probably more now. I spend most of my time now producing and engineering than playing. Part of it comes from a desire to reinvent myself. Here's the thing. If Frank Sinatra were still singing, or Ella, I'd still be playing for him. And I wouldn't have the career that I have. So I find that for me, about every 10 years of my life, I start changing things up. Like I'm working with operatic tenors now. I produced Placido Domingo last year. I love that. I'm producing Latin pop stars. And it has nothing to do genre-wise with Ella and Basie, but all that knowledge translates no matter what genre I'm working with. The TV thing came out of the athletic department at USC having some money and wanting to give it to the jazz department, and they were going to give the music department at USC $1 million in 2007 to produce 2 concerts a year, and I was asked to produce those concerts, and that led to the PBS special 90th birthday celebration of Ella, and it was my first time jumping in that pond. I'd been producing records for a while, but I had no idea what was involved in producing a television show. It was exponentially more challenging, I'll say. It ended up being a great performances PBS special, and it was great. I mean, we had Quincy and Stevie Wonder and Natalie Cole and Nancy Wilson and Monica Mancini, and I mean, it was just a really amazing lineup. That led to a partner of mine named Tim Swift, who produces a lot of content for PBS. And I was asked to start coming in as music director and then as a music producer on the Christmas shows from the White House. So I did all but one of the White House Christmas shows under Obama. And that led to me working with the Library of Congress, and I started producing the Gershwin Prize. So I've done about 4 or 5 Gershwin Prize PBS specials. And, it just sort of took me in that direction. And when you do the White House shows, or when you do the shows for the Gershwin Prize for Library of Congress, they have a lot of diverse artists on it. So I was getting exposed to Latin artists. I was getting exposed to classical artists, and found that I had an interest and love for doing that, and started letting the road take me in those directions.
You had wanted to have that PBS special at the Apollo, but it wasn't able to, those plans did not work out. But the opportunity came up again about, I think, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I'm not sure when the planning process began for this, but the idea came up again to possibly hold a concert paying tribute to Ella at the Apollo. Tell us that story.
A neighbor of ours in New York, literally across the hall in our apartment building, was on the board of the Apollo. And she knew that I'd worked with Ella, and Ella's 100th birthday was coming up. And I said, "What are you guys doing for the 100th birthday?" And she said, "I don't know that we have anything planned." And this was about 8 or 9 months before the birthday. She put me in touch with Camilla Forbes, who is at that point was the new creative executive director of the Apollo. And we got on the phone, and I said, "What are you guys doing?" And she said, "Well, we don't really have anything planned." And I said, "Well, I'd love to get involved." And so we threw out some ideas. They did a little due diligence and, saw what we had done in 10 years before and liked it. And that was the spark for recreating this evening at the Apollo, which I have to tell you, I've been doing this a long time, and I don't think I've ever experienced anything on any stage anywhere as I did that night. It was absolutely mind-blowing, actually.
And the main point that you wanted to drive home, I really liked reading about this. Your whole idea behind this event was not just to have people come out and sing Ella's songs as she might have sung them. That would have been well and good, but you wanted to take things a little bit deeper. You wanted somehow for these performances to help tell Ella's story. Why was it important that her story be shared at this event?
That's a great question. I think for me, the missed opportunity with a lot of tribute concerts is exactly what you just said. You bring people out on stage and they sing songs associated with the singer. But in the case of, if you're doing a Frank Sinatra tribute or Ella, these are mostly a Great American Songbook songs. So they could be associated with any number of people. And here we were at the Apollo, where it all began. I imagine many of your listeners know this story already, but Ella actually told me the story. She went to the Apollo when she was 17, not to sing. She entered the Apollo amateur contest to dance. And by complete synchronicity, that night of the amateur contest, there were these 2 young women called the Edwards Sisters, who were a professional dance act from Harlem that had traveled to California. They'd made a movie, and they came back to Harlem, and they were the cause célèbre of Harlem. And they decided to, very unusually, have the Edwards Sisters perform on stage and then start the amateur contest. And Ella told me she was the first one up to follow the Edwards Sisters. And she said, I couldn't do it. And she made a last-minute call to sing. So that's a pretty interesting story. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if for our Apollo audience, for the 100th birthday, we could recreate that moment? So I reached out to Misty Copeland, who is the prima ballerina with the ABT, to ask her if she would come out and dance and be our Edwards sister. And then we would basically recreate it as almost a dramatic event. And unfortunately, ABT wouldn't let me have her because they were in the middle of their season. So Camilla Forbes and Laura Greer from the Apollo came up with the idea of, why don't we create a vintage radio broadcast of that night? And we'll tell the story of how Ella comes out, she gets introduced. And so we did it. And I brought in David Allen Greer to recreate Ralph Cooper, who was the original host back then of the Apollo, And the way the concert started is our curtains were closed, lights came down, and you hear the vintage radio broadcast start. And at the end of that broadcast, which is about 2 or 3 minutes, our curtains opened up and our young Ella is standing in front of a vintage microphone. And that's how our concert started. So we transitioned to the live concert. So the audience got a sense of what that poor young girl, and the young lady that played Ella for us was also 17. She was a freshman at Howard University. Great young singer named Ayodele Owalabi. So when you hear the album that we recorded from the concert, it actually starts off with our vintage radio broadcast. The artists that we chose, like in the case of Patty Austin and Monica Mancini, they knew Ella. And it's not so much third person anymore. They could talk about Ella from the first person. And we wanted to basically start way back with Tisket a Tasket, one of Ella's first hits. And then we moved to something else from that era with Patty. When I Get Low, I Get High. And then it just starts transitioning through the decades of her careers. We wanted to recreate some of her famous duets. So, the Porgy and Bess album with Ella and Louis Armstrong is iconic. So we had David Alan Grier and Patty recreate some moments from that record. So basically, when you went through the whole concert, and as each of these artists talked about Ella, and the entire concert was scripted, by the way, so it had a narrative. So I think when you got to the end of the concert, you really understood a lot more about who Ella was.
What do you think is it about Ella's music that does allow it to reach across generations, that helps it to maintain that timeless appeal?
Great question. Well, I think it comes down to she was obviously a very unique talent. And also you felt when she was singing that you were part of it. There wasn't, sometimes when an artist, Cassandra Wilson mentioned this, I thought she hit the nail on the head. She said, when artists start thinking of themselves as celebrities, they tend to take on walls. And they're walls that keep them from really seeing who their fans seeing who the artist is. Ella's fans never suffered that. Ella's fans, when you were watching her in a concert, you were all in on it. If she sang one of the lyrics from Honeysuckle Rose, "Don't buy sugar, you just have to touch my cup," and she smiles and winks when she says it, it's like we're all in on it. And she was that inclusive, I suppose. And it still translates. You hear it in her music, the honesty. Probably in some ways, even more than Frank, because Frank was, he was ring-a-ding-ding and it was cool and he drank Jack Daniels, and there was the cultural side of Frank that was attractive. Ella was just the singing, pure and simple. There was nothing beyond just that beautiful, pure talent that transcends race, that transcends generations. She's completely unique. Jay, as you ask the question, I think about these things more, and I think that's the appeal. She's transcendent of generation and of music styles.
The story, as I remember, was that as you were producing the album, you realized that you had some time left. And on an average CD, there is 1 hour and 20 minutes, 80 minutes that you can use. That hasn't changed. And even when I looked at the time and I said, well, they just about used every bit of it. Only 18 seconds left that could be used by my count. So you said, how do we utilize some of this time left? And you included a recording from Ella herself. It was a live recording from Budapest from, what was it, the 60s, early 70s, I guess?
I think early 70s, yeah. Actually, what sparked it was something Monica Mancini said in her introduction of Once in a While. And she knew Ella. And I used to hear Ella say this, and so did Monica. She used to say, I wonder if people will remember me. And she didn't ask the question so that she would hear our response. She literally wondered, she was so humble she literally wondered if she would be remembered. And, to the rest of us, it was like, are you kidding? And then I wanted to include something of Ella on the album. And I remember hearing that version of People. And she says at the end, she gets away from the lyric and she talks about how much people mean to her. I thought, if you listen to the album from top to bottom, and basically the penultimate song is Monica singing, setting up Once in a While, and then the additional encore is Ella. And I think it was just more of the emotional arc that I wanted to include that at the end. It was in inspiration of that song. And it really worked. And, the other thing is I needed, by complete luck, the size of the audience, wherever she sang in Budapest, was virtually the same size as the audience of the 1,500 we had at the Apollo. And I could transition right out of the Apollo applause into that. So it felt seamless, right? And that it's just a little encore love letter back from Ella to her fans at the end. I'll tell you, unique to the CD, by the way, is there's a performance of Ain't Misbehavin' by Andra Day. And it's an amazing performance. And the arrangement was done by Nelson Riddle. And it was written for Ella in 1980 for a Carpenter's TV special. And it was never recorded or performed again. And I found it. So this is the first recording release of it. Unfortunately, because Andra has an album that's about to come out, you can't hear it on the streaming version on Spotify or Pandora. You can only hear that performance on the CD. So if you're an Andra Day fan, buy the CD because it's an amazing performance.
And guess who can hear it? Thankfully, we have that file. So it's a fun performance. And you read my mind about something because you went back to the improvised lyric that Ella did on Bob Merrill and Julie Stein's People. I'm so thankful for people like you. And the stories I heard about Ella, she was very shy. One of the most outgoing people, one of the most outspoken vocalists, and yet she was so shy. There was another thing that you brought up. You said she would often wonder, will people remember me? I think her memory and her legacy is certainly cemented in jazz history. And there was one moment from that history that you remembered as you and several other of your colleagues were on stage at the Apollo. I think you were behind the curtain at one point, and you noticed something very special about the space that you were in. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, it was pretty emotional. It's really quite an undertaking to put a tribute concert together with a lot of artists. So there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of emotion, and you really are plugged in and everything is pretty high charge, especially 5 minutes before you're about to open the curtain. So we were all on the stage. And Jay, unique to a stage like the Apollo, I could think of Carnegie Hall, Hollywood Bowl, maybe Royal Albert Hall, certainly in London. There are those few theaters that are so iconic that when you're on the stage, everybody's performances are lifted, right? Because you know where you are. Well, couple that with you're at a place where one of the most famous singers of all time sang for the first time and changed the course of American popular music forever, arguably. So we're on stage. It's Count Basie's band, string section. The lights are, obviously really low back, on stage before the curtain opens. And there is a vintage 1934 microphone downstage center on the very old floor of the Apollo stage with this sort of ghosted light on it. And I saw it and I realized, my God, that's the spot. That's the spot where Ella sang for the first time. And all of the memories of Ella started flooding back to me. And I put my, gave me a lump in the throat. And I turned to the guys in Basie's band. I said, hey, guys, that's the spot. It was like 6 feet in front of us. That's the spot where Ella sang for the first time. I said, let's really do this for Ella. And everybody felt it. And that emotion permeated the entire evening. Everybody felt it. I mean, it's the coming together of that physical spot, being in the Apollo Theater at the moment, at the 100th birthday celebration of that moment. And what does that do to you as an artist? To consider all that before you start to uncork a performance. Well, it was amazing. I got a note from the reviewer from Downbeat magazine a couple days later, Russ Musto, and he said, Greg, he said, I've been going to live jazz concerts for 50 years, and this is the greatest concert I've ever seen. And that's how we all felt. We all came out of there, the artists, the stagehands, everybody, like, wow, that was absolutely incredible.
Truly historic moments, as shared by Gregg Field. The name of that live concert release is Ella at 100, live at the Apollo, and it's available from Concord Jazz. Be listening for selections from that album and upcoming shows from Simply Timeless. Our thanks to you for joining us this week. We hope to see you again soon. And until then, I'm Jay Daniels. This is In Studio.